Hello and welcome to JSB Talks Digital, the podcast for marketers, digital transformation champions, and those of you bringing your skills into the digital age. I'm Joanne Sweeney-Burke and this podcast is brought to you by Digital Training Institute. Before we begin today's show, I want to share some award news with you. I'm delighted to announce that the Digital Training Institute blog has been awarded Silver in the Best Corporate Marketing and Communications category. Congratulations to all the winners at the V by Very Blog Awards 2017, and a big thank you to Asheville Media, the organisers, and Littlewoods Ireland, the sponsors. Jump over to the blog to read about my win and the highlights from the event. Back to business, and in this episode of JSB Talks Digital, I'm focusing on GDPR, the most important change in data privacy regulations in 20 years. Coming up in today's show, in social media news, you can now cross-post Insta stories to Facebook stories. Instagram adds polls in stories, and Google reveals a suite of new Pixel products. Prepare to be wowed. I interviewed Derek O'Neill, Global Security Lead at Nitro Software, Ask JSB, in shoutouts, 3 frequently asked questions about GDPR, in JSB's column, how to collect data with data protection in mind, and find out what privacy tool saved my working week.
Social media news.
Things just keep heating up in the world of social media. News this week that we can now cross-post our Insta stories to Facebook is sure to shake up the world of dark social. Speaking to TechCrunch, Facebook said, "You now have the option to share your Instagram stories to your Facebook stories. We're always working to make it easier to share any moment with the people who matter to you." While you can't do the reverse, posting Facebook stories to Instagram stories, Facebook hasn't ruled out building that in the future. Instagram has added a new engagement feature to stories. We can now conduct a poll. Not only that, we can make creative use of stickers with live results from your followers as they participate. Nice work, Instagram. Jump over to JSB Grams right now to see my poll on my stories feed. It was a really big week for Google as it revealed a series of second-generation products known as Pixel at a launch event in San Francisco. Here's the shopping list of what was unveiled by company CEO Sundar Pichai. 2 smartphones, 3 smart speakers, a laptop, a stylus, an upgraded virtual reality headset, and a pair of wireless earbuds that can translate a conversation in real time. So what's the common denominator for all these products? Well, they're all connected to Google Assistant, the artificial intelligent helper. Watch the live event and view the products on the blog post associated with this podcast over at digitaltraining.ie.
Interview.
In today's show, I interviewed Derek O'Neill, Global Security Lead at Nitro Software. I caught up with Derek at their offices in Dublin, and I asked him about GDPR and the implications for organisations of all sizes. Derek is also a member of the Information Systems Audit and Control Association and former chair of the Irish Information Security Forum.
JSB Talks Digital.
Okay, so Derek O'Neill, you are the Global Security Lead at Nitro, based in the Irish office here in Dublin. Today I want to talk about GDPR. In my industry in digital marketing, I guess we're all preoccupied about having to anonymize data and we're not really sure what's involved. So I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to let my listeners know a bit more on the podcast. So GDPR stands for the EU General Data Protection Regulation, and some commentators say that it's the most important data privacy regulation in 20 years. What is GDPR in simple terms? What do we need to know?
What we need to know is that it's not actually new. It's enforcing a lot of principles that have been in place and have been well understood since the early 70s. So every EU member state would have a number of laws relating to data protection and data privacy. What GDPR is doing is making all of the EU member states subscribe to one single regulation. So before that, we would have had directives, and the directives would have had equivalents in local law. What we're going to have from the 25th of May next year is all of the member states will have one law, just one, and it will apply equally across all 28 member states.
So essentially a harmonisation of data protection law.
That's the word you hear a lot, harmonisation. How harmonious it will be remains to be seen.
So why has it been introduced? Is it just to create that harmony so that everybody's sticking to the same law? Or is it because of the explosion of digital and how we're using data and how important data has become to businesses and organisations?
I'd say it's mostly a reaction because you've got the European Commission and the European Council reacting to the fact that we have so much more personal data readily available. So it's a reaction to the state of play that we have. A lot of that is to do with mobile, a lot of to do with that is to do with social media, a lot of that is to do with ordinary businesses and even semi-states and governments going online to handle things. So a great example of that is a couple of years ago, the property tax, the local property tax in Ireland, handled online very, very smoothly. In as much as it was a pleasure to pay, it was easy to do. But it was a huge amount of of data protection impact that people may not have considered when they were giving to the government their names, addresses, their credit card details, and some more details on their finance that maybe they didn't want to share. So it's a kind of a reaction to that. But I do see it as a good thing. I do see it as the European Parliament trying to give control of citizens' data back to citizens, and we should probably endorse it for that reason alone. But it has yet to happen. I'm optimistic that it will make things better, but it has yet to happen.
So how do we define personal data? Like when I go on social media, I'm sharing an email address, perhaps my geolocation, who's in my network of friends and family, my career. Like, is personal data like everything?
The umbrella term under GDPR has expanded, so there's two things to consider. There's what people think about as sensitive data, or what they call special categories, and that's the like of race, ethnicity, political or religious beliefs you might have. Are you a member of a trade union? Do you have particular health issues, or do you have particular gender orientation? Those things are what we call special categories of data, and they're incredibly sensitive and obviously very personal. But according to the EU, the European Commission, personal data is anything that relates to an individual. So that can be your personal life, your private life, your public life, your name, home addresses, photographs that you appear in, things that you endorse, even the beer you drink. Obvious things like email addresses, bank details, financial details, things that you post, things that you publish, medical information, health information, dietary information, and as you say, geolocation, your IP address. And for me, the last one is quite sticky because you give away your IP address with every single transaction you do on the web. Every single packet that your browser sends contains your IP. But that is, strictly speaking, according to GDPR, that is personal information and will have to be managed accordingly. So, yeah, for me, that was one of the biggest things to appreciate about GDPR, the actual broad definition of what constitutes personal data.
So now that we've got the definition, we know why it's been taken in. How do we actually manage the process? How can you actually protect that data that is so widely available and that's published so frequently by people? What is our responsibility as organisations and business owners?
Well, there's two parts to it. One is the responsibilities that the organisations have, and then the other aspect is the rights that the individual has, and you can approach the problem from either end. So obviously, in business, you're going to have much more concern for the data in bulk that you process and the data in bulk that you control, and you will have to react to individuals exercising their rights. It's a very big question. You know, there's no pithy answer. It's a very big question, and it's got to do with taking into account the existing principles, like I say, the ones that have been around since the 70s, and being able to prove your compliance with them and being able to react to any demands that are made by what we call the data subject or the individuals who are making the request. So the way I like to approach it is to get people to think about their individual rights and then to try and draw back from that. So people have focused on the right to be forgotten. That's one of the rights. Another right is that you've got a right to access all of the personal information that a company holds on you. So if you think about that from the other end, you've got to be able to present back to the customer what data you hold. Those customers then have the right to modify or correct that data. So as a business, you've got to be able to react to that. And then people have got rights to restrict the usage. So if I sign up for your digital marketing and I subscribe to a particular service, you can't then offer me something else on the basis of that unless I explicitly opt in. So as a business, how do I manage the explicit opt-in? How do I record that I presented these details and I gave you the opportunity to think about it and say, I will not sign up to this, or I will sign up to this, but that was a conscious decision. How do you record that? As a business, that's going to be quite tricky. So I'd encourage people to think about it from what they call user stories. So how an individual will engage with the business, how the business must react. It's actually the same question. It's just two angles to approach it.
Do you think then that the larger technology companies like Google, for example, and Facebook, have they already been doing this as part of their good business practices, or are there implications for them as well?
Yes and yes. So the short answer is that any organization that has more than 250 people will have been obliged to appoint a data protection officer, or any organization that does its business primarily in managing personal information, which kind of covers Google and Facebook. They will have certain obligations that will become even more restrictive under GDPR. But it's not all doom and gloom. In a lot of cases, you can already satisfy those rights. So Google will allow you to be forgotten. Facebook will allow you to delete the account. But where you've got secondary or references or links, you may not always have control of that. So it's kind of truisms, but if you think about once you post it, you've lost control of it. You have to think about that when you're making statements or you're making posts or you're making contributions online. So that kind of stuff, things you say may never disappear. Other things you can be forgotten, but you've got to ask what you're being forgotten for. So if you do business with Nitro and you ask to be forgotten, you basically don't want people to know you bought a particular product. That's fine. It's different to being a member of an insurance company or a member of a gym or a patient of a doctor. So the aspects of the data that's held versus the exposure and what that might mean. So you could be, for example, gluten intolerant. Maybe that's not a big deal to you. Maybe it is. It's the individual who gets to decide. So it's a responsibility for that individual to manage that data. The organizations then have another corresponding and probably larger and more enforceable set of responsibilities. And it's who's got skin in the game? Who's got to manage the problem? It's actually both sides of it.
So for those of us that are holding data currently on our customers, our subscribers, our online community, are we retrospectively going to have to data check those sources and the permission that we got from those individuals? What would you recommend?
So data that you already hold was covered by the data protection regulation and directive in force at that time. Strictly speaking, you could be challenged to prove that you had consent or that you gathered that data lawfully, or that you're using it for the purpose to which it was intended. I would say 90% of the privacy statements that I've seen for larger businesses cover those questions already, because like I said, the principles of data protection are not new. They are well understood, and if people have been satisfying the existing data protection regulations, they will be well placed to satisfy GDPR as well.
Is there something in GDPR about anonymizing data so that an individual can't be identified, but instead, sort of like how Google operates, that you have your own ID number that's anonymized?
So that's what that's referring to, a concept of pseudo-anonymization, where an individual can be controlled or referenced, but other people looking at that unique identifier can't tell who they are. So it's not a new thing, and it's not even particularly difficult. And where it's interesting is that GDPR specifically allows for pseudo-anonymization. If there's a breach of pseudo-anonymized data, it's not considered a breach at all. It's not considered a problem. And that kind of begs the question, if you manage chunks of data for individuals, why don't you pseudo-anonymize it? If it's possible to do, you could save yourself a lot of grief even when you do have a data protection issue. And I think it's fair to say that almost every company at some point will. It's just a question of how well you react and how well you handle that.
Talking about data protection issues, there was a case recently that we spoke about before this interview, and you said it was a really good example of what might happen a company in the event that they have a data breach, whether it's through theft or whether it's through some gap in their own processes. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, so the biggest one, the most recent one that I would be familiar with, and I'm sure people have heard of, is the Equifax Credit Bureau. So the US-based organization that's supposed to monitor what they call credit scoring, and they're in the business of protecting and managing people's personal information. So it's particularly poignant because they were impacted in a hack. So it's important to know that this was an attack, that people actually said about this. And upwards of 143 million sets of personal data were exposed. So in most cases, that was just names, addresses, social security numbers, in some cases, driver license numbers. And for a couple of 100,000, also, there was credit card details and financial records. So for those few people, that was quite substantial. But if you think about the overall hack, 143 million people, that's almost 1 in every 2 US citizens. So not small beans at all. And it's not even the biggest breach. So it's the most recent one I can think of. It's not even the biggest breach. If you go back to 2016, there was a breach in Yahoo where people's social media details were leaked, and there was upwards of 1 billion with a B people involved there. And it kind of becomes forgotten about. Now, you can argue that your Yahoo record is not terribly sensitive, but I'll counter that by saying your Equifax details were enormously sensitive. And even for the people who didn't have financial data or credit card data, everything else that was leaked is the basis of identity theft. It's the things that, ironically, Equifax are trying to protect against.
And if we think about data, I mean, when a company owns data on their customers or their subscribers or their community, there's trust given to a company by individuals. And if that trust is broken by virtue of a data breach, then I'm sure it can have a particular impact on whether it's share price or customer base. What sort of penalties are we looking at when it comes to anybody flouting the GDPR laws?
There's a couple of things to think about here. One is that the Equifax attack is primarily US based. So we can talk about it and we can think about it, but right now it's not subject to GDPR. So just to get that out of the way. There's also another thing to consider before we get to the answer, and that's the fact that the customers in this case weren't the individuals who got breached. It was businesses that those individuals were trying to do business with. So if I had lived in the States, I may never have consciously engaged with Equifax, but they would know my credit score and they would have details on me, even though I'm not a customer. So the level of trust and the chain of trust is somewhat disconnected. My trust relationship in that case was actually with the likes of PC World or Currys or one of these vendors that I went to for some kind of credit transaction. They would have kicked off a credit score or a credit check for good business reasons, which means that Equifax from that point on would have my details, even though I may not know who they are. So you have to be careful when you think about customers in this case. There were none. These were people who were, in some cases, if not most cases, oblivious to Equifax and the fact that they held data at all.
Financial penalties, or I know penalties even relating to imprisonment if you flout the GDPR laws.
Okay, so there is a sliding scale, and one of the big changes with GDPR is enforcement and the fact that you can levy financial penalties. So in the case of a first offence, you could be looking at a warning. If it's something non-intentional or a lack of compliance, you could be looking at a warning. You could be looking at a situation where you're obliged to provide evidence of regular audits. And then when it gets more serious, you're looking at fines of up to 10 million or up to 2% of your annual turnover. And then in the worst case, the provision is for fines of at least 20 million or 4% of the annual worldwide turnover, which is a huge number. So if you think about Equifax, if you think about that their posted revenue for 2016 was 3.14 billion, then 4% of that, if my maths is correct, is 126 million euro, which is not small beans. So there's been a lot of fallout from that, and it hasn't even happened. It hasn't really occurred yet. It hasn't really gelled yet because a lot of the people who are involved are still reacting. So this broke September 7th. In the week since then, we've seen the Chief Information Officer and the Chief Security Officer have both retired. There's also been some talk about a number of very senior people in Equifax selling stock after they discovered the breach, but before they went public. So that's bringing up questions of insider trading. Obviously, I can't say that's happened, but it's the subject of a congressional investigation, so it's quite significant. And the sums involved from those C-level people of stock were in the millions. So again, not small beans.
So when I was looking at the GDPR website, they spoke about a 2-year post-adoption grace period. Does this mean that, we might have 2 years from May 2018 to get our house in order?
No is the short answer, and there's quite a few people who have read that and they think that there is a state of grace for a number of years. It's very important to understand that GDPR is in force today. It was actually passed into law on the 4th of May 2016, and there's a 2-year grace period or period of understanding from then, and that actually expires next May. So we're not in a grace period, we're approaching the end of it, and there will not be 2 years of grace. So if people have yet to prepare, there's not a lot of time left to waste.
So what do we need to do if we've never really had a data protection officer, if we've never put in protocols or processes in terms of data protection? What are the first couple of steps that we need to do?
The very first thing is to wrap your arms around it and don't ignore it. It's not going to go away. It's as serious to the ability to do business as every other aspect of compliance. So your financial compliance, your tax compliance, your health and safety, your welfare, all of those obligations. This is another one, and it should be treated in the same way. It's part and parcel of doing business. So if you deal in personal data, or your business handles personal data of customers, and that's almost everyone, then you need to be sure that you can observe and prove that you've observed what is now the law on that personal data. So even something as simple as your CRM system, your list of customers, you're going to have names, addresses, phone numbers. In some cases, you'll have tax details. In other cases, you'll have credit card information when you've processed payments. You may have bank account numbers from processing checks. All of that is personal data. All of that is subject to GDPR. All of that is an obligation that your business has as a controller. In some cases, you'll also be a processor of that information. And it's very important to understand that you will be obliged from the 25th of May to be able to react in a very short time frame to any of those rights that are exercised by your customers. So any one of your customers can, on the 25th of May, ask for a detailed list of the data you hold. They can ask to have that corrected. They can invoke the right to be forgotten. That can be trumped by your right to do business, but there's a relationship there, so you've got to think about that. There's other rights, like they can invoke the right not to be processed by algorithms, that they can only be handled by individuals, and they can then ask about things like data portability, like where you store that data, and where you store it, and where the services you rely on to do business may have backups comes into play as well. Because if it's outside of the EU, you've got to think about that. So there's a lot that could be considered, and there's a lot that should be considered. But the very first thing to do is actually embrace it. It's not going to go away.
And I think it would be naive for any organization, no matter what size, to think that, well, you know what, I'm not the size of Nitro, I'm not the size of Facebook or Google, maybe they won't chase me. That's a completely naive view.
I think it is naive, and I think certainly there's a fear in the industry that there will be a level of ambulance chasing, and that people who know organizations are not prepared for this will be seen as a target for opportunistic or frivolous claims where people may make requests that they know can't be satisfied and then hope to just create trouble or even just make life interesting for organizations. So I'd say if you're a large size organization, you've got more than 250 employees, you've already got a data protection officer or a privacy officer. If you've got less than 250 employees and the business is managing data, then you've got an obligation. If you're even smaller again, you may not be as well prepared, much like smaller organizations may not have good accounting practices or good expense practices, what have you. They're still obliged to satisfy them, so the obligation is still there. What I would suggest to people who have absolutely no clue is to look at the IBEC website. Now, I'm not affiliated, but they have a couple of very straightforward, concise guides on what small businesses should do to prepare for GDPR, and that's what should happen. If you think about the countdown, there's 240 days between now and 25th of May. So take bank holidays and weekends out of that, it's a lot less. So you should really be well entrenched in your reaction. If you're only starting to think about it now, I'd think hard and fast.
Derek, I've been thinking about GDPR for a while. I didn't really understand it. Having conversations with my colleagues in the digital marketing world, I think you've explained it in real simple terms. And I don't think that we're under any illusion right now and from here forward that we all have a responsibility when it comes to data, and it's not just the big boys that have a responsibility. So thank you so much for joining me on JSB Talks Digital and for explaining the whole world of GDPR.
Shoutouts.
In this part of the show, I give shoutouts to individuals, organizations, or brands that are remarkable online and worth talking about. But in this week's show, I'm sharing 3 frequently asked questions about GDPR.
1.
When is GDPR coming into effect? Well, the GDPR was approved and adopted by the EU Parliament in April 2016. The regulation takes effect from next May 2018.
2.
In light of an uncertain Brexit, should UK data protection officers still continue with GDPR planning and preparation? If you process data about individuals in the context of selling goods or services to citizens in other EU countries, then you will need to comply with the GDPR, irrespective as to whether or not you or the UK retains the GDPR post-Brexit. If your activities are limited to the UK, then the position after the initial exit period is much less clear. The UK government has indicated it will implement an equivalent or alternative legal mechanism.
3.
What does the GDPR affect? The GDPR not only applies to organisations located within the EU, but it will also apply to organisations located outside the EU if they offer goods or services to or monitor the behaviour of EU data subjects. Basically, it applies to all companies processing and holding the personal data of data subjects residing in the European Union, regardless of the company's location.
Ask JSB.
In this part of the show, I bring the voice of my listeners onto the podcast. This week's question comes from Marie-Claire of Now Media.
Hi Joanne, Marie-Claire here from Now Media. I have a question for you in relation to GDPR that's coming out May next year, I believe. As a small business owner, I'm kind of concerned how it will affect me. And I have a question. For example, I have a drawer full of business cards and some I've made contact with, some I haven't. People would have given them to me at events. So what is the GDPR stance on that? Can I hold that drawer full of business cards? Do I have a right to? Can I input their data in my spreadsheet, in my contacts, or reuse it for digital marketing purposes? Do I need permission? So what is the stance on holding business cards with people's data that they would have given to me at events in respect of GDPR? I'd love your advice. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Marie-Claire. Oh, the old business card. A networker and a marketer's dream. Right now, you can probably find the details of a business contact on LinkedIn or on a company website. However, when somebody hands you their business card, a real connection has been made. With all data that you receive, you need to let the person know how you might use their data. So from here on in, the best practice approach would be to ask the person in person if they want to subscribe to your e-sign or your blog right there and then. Of course, you must always give them an opportunity to unsubscribe at any stage, but all email marketing software offers this as a standard right now. But here is a good rule of thumb. If you feel you are spamming your database, you probably are. Let's all raise the standards of digital marketing together and remember to collect and to use data responsibly.
JSB's column.
In today's column, I discuss how to collect digital data with data protection in mind. Data is the currency of digital marketers, but in a more data-conscious world, we need to be mindful of how we collect and use customer and stakeholder information. To make sure your customers or your users' agreement will stand up legally, use what's called a click wrap method. This is where your customer or user has to click I agree to your privacy policy in some way. This could be when they sign up to receive your marketing messages or when they make a purchase on your website. For this to work, you will need to make sure that you have a privacy policy and terms of service in place which are linkable for your prospect to read on your website. Another way to protect customer privacy when you collect information is to use an SSL certificate. This means that the connection between your website and the user's browser is secure when data is transmitted. Ensure that any websites you use with your customers have SSL enabled. Another potential security issue is the storage of customer data. A popular way for many online businesses and marketing companies to store data is to use the cloud. To reassure your customers that you are keeping their data safe, always choose a reputable provider. It's really good practice to use service providers in your own jurisdiction because the data privacy laws are so varied worldwide. So, in summary, set up a privacy policy on your website, require your customers or website users to agree to it when you collect information from them. Once you've collected the data, keep it with a reputable cloud storage provider, and protect yourself from liability in the case of data loss or a breach of data.
Social media tool of the week.
With this episode of JSB Talks Digital being about privacy, it's appropriate that the social media tool that saved my working week this week helps me to stay safe online while I'm on the move. NordVPN is a provider of a virtual private network, which gives you privacy while surfing online using publicly available Wi-Fi. Did you know that you can't really be safe online without a VPN? I invested $3.29 per month for 2 years for this service. It's a steal. Check out their features and their special offer now at nordvpn.com. And no, I don't have an affiliate arrangement with this company. It's simply a JSB recommendation. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of JSB Talks Digital. We've now reached episode 68. To ensure you never miss a show, please subscribe on your smartphone on iTunes, Stitcher, or on SoundCloud. We're also on Libsyn, the largest podcast network in the world. If you happen to be a regular listener, I'd love if you could take a few minutes to post a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, I have everything discussed on today's show on my award-winning blog, digitaltraining.ie. And don't forget, send me your burning digital marketing questions. Log on to digitaltraininginstitute.ie/AskJSB. To keep up with JSB's digital diaries, you can follow me on Twitter at tweetsbyJSB. Log on to our Facebook page, Digital Training Institute. You can also snap me at JSB Snaps or follow my stories at JSB Grams. I'm Joanne Sweeney Burke. This is JSB Talks Digital. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.
JSB Talks Digital.